Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon to those in the East Coast or in the West Coast. Welcome to our two-part guest lectures this week. I will first introduce our guest speaker. We will proceed with an hour lecture. And then I will moderate some questions and we'll have some discussion. It is an honor to host Dr. Ruth Gornandt this week at the St. Esther Seminary. Dr. Gornandt is a researcher in historical and systematic theology at the University of Oxford. After her studies in Roman Catholic and Protestant theologies and Romance languages, she entered training for ministry in the Lutheran Church. She obtained her doctorate in theology from Humboldt University in Berlin. In her doctoral thesis, she investigated the critique of scholastic metaphysics in Protestant theologians of the 19th and 20th centuries. For the past years, she studied the potential of traditional theological doctrines to process challenges from current scientific research, especially the question of how to accommodate cognitive science of religion, that is CSR for short, in theology. It was during these studies where she discovered the importance of mystical theology, as expressed particularly in the Orthodox theologies, to define the relation between reason and faith, or science and theology. Her current research investigates the well-renowned Armenian philosopher and theologian Grigor Vartavatsi, or Gregory of Datev, whose work offers intriguing perspectives on this very question of reason and faith. That is the bridging of the heart and the mind in the Christian worldview. Today's lecture in particular, and this is part one of lecture continuing on Friday, is entitled Implanted in Us by Nature, the Cognitive Science of Religion and its Importance for Theology. Is belief in God innate to human nature? Modern science, and particularly cognitive science of religion, holds that religion emerges from human cognition and its intuitions. In other words, the evidence of belief points to the naturalness of religious belief, in the sense that belief arises in humans without a formal education, but from cognitive processes of the human mind. Does this research of the so-called CSR lend support to a renewal of the traditional doctrines of belief? These are some of the questions, and I would now introduce Dr. Ruth Gornandt to give us her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to express my gratitude for being here tonight. My gratitude to the Dean of St. Nerses Armenian Seminary, Father Mardiros, to Professor Irwin, and of course to Dr. Shahinian for the opportunity to visit the seminary and to speak to you tonight. Thank you very much. Shall I start sharing the screen now? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Here we go. Yeah, I will talk about the cognitive science of religion, CSR in short. It's a relatively young science. It emerged during the 1990s, and it came together when scientists from various disciplines, anthropology, evolutionary science, developmental psychology, began applying methods from cognitive science to religion. Their starting point was they wanted to explain the universal spread of religion. You can find religion everywhere, through the times, through the cultures, but also the observation that there is not an infinite variability of religious ideas and behaviors. So if you observe different religions, different cultures, there are certain recurring features. And the assumption was that both the universal spread, but also the recurring features can be explained by relating religion and human cognition. However, we have to say, in our tradition, in theology and philosophy, the universality of religion had been noticed before that, long before that, and has been the object of considerations for millennia, you can say. Very early, philosophy and theology perceived the fact that apparently everywhere humans were religious, even though the concrete religions differed, of course. But in all their differences, there seemed to be a core of features and beliefs which were universal. So the ubiquitous presence of those features and beliefs was attributed in philosophy and theology to human nature. They're thinking they are part of the natural condition of humanity, and therefore some called them innate. Natural in us, innate, that must somehow be connected. In my research in the last few years, I tried to relate both approaches, the cognitive science and this theological tradition. I'm interested in exploring if these modern scientific theories are in some way commensurate with the traditional theological understanding. If they are, and I do think they are, but not unconditionally, this will have several consequences. First, science confirms a traditional theological topic, which I will talk about, usually rejected today. It will help theology to understand the universality of religion better and adapt the doctrine accordingly. And it will show us the systematic place of this research, the scientific research in theology, and subsequently to what extent theology can or has to integrate it. So in this lecture, I would like to show you how philosophy and above all theology describe the universality of religion. I will give you a selection of the vast wealth of sources. That's my first part. Then in the second part, I will introduce some relevant aspects of the cognitive science of religion. And in my third part, I will ask how theology could accommodate CSR's research and what it would mean for the doctrine of an innate knowledge of God, for this traditional doctrine. So I will start with my first part with the mainly theological aspects. So the title of my presentation is taken from John of Damascus. John of Damascus writes at the beginning of his exposition of the Christian faith, "Nobody has ever seen God. Therefore the divine is ineffable and incomprehensible. However, God did not leave us in complete ignorance, because the knowledge that God is has been implanted in all by him naturally or by nature. Furthermore, the creation itself, its cohesion and governance, proclaim the magnificence of the divine nature, and through the law and prophets at first, then also through his only begotten Son, he has manifested the knowledge of himself." So, despite this opening, despite his big precaution that nobody has ever seen God, there are ways of knowing him. Of course, there's revelation, so that's the third point, the law, the prophets, and then Christ. We know through them of God. Another is the knowledge from creation. That's, for example, what Paul talks in Romans 1 about. But in the first place, what he mentions in the first place is the knowledge of God is being naturally given. It is there, naturally. And he to pronounce this, to stress this. He was not the first. His assertion can be related to broad tradition in Greek and Roman thinking. For example, the Stoics. Cicero is one of the Roman philosophers who write about it. He writes, "For it is innate in all, and as it were engraved into the soul, the notion that gods exist." So he comes from this Stoic tradition. So that means the knowledge of God is regarded as included in human nature and therefore independent of education and culture. And the tradition goes on in theology. The early Christian writer Tertullian coins the phrase of the witness of the naturally Christian soul. And he writes, and that's a beautiful passage, "Nature is the teacher, the soul is the pupil. Whatever either the former, nature, has taught, or the latter, the soul, has learned, has been handed over by God. That is the teacher of nature herself. So what wonder if she, the soul, knows him by whom she has been given." So, and we have about 100 years later, the Christian apologetic Arnobius Afrus. He died in 330. And he uses this idea during the Diocletian persecutions. He wants to defend the Christian faith in one supreme God, while this God, he argues, cannot be proven by rational arguments. The belief that there is God is present naturally. So he writes, he poses this rhetorical question: is there any human who has not entered the first day of his birth with the notion of this principle, to whom it may not be innate, not attached, indeed, as it were, not imprinted in their mother's womb, not implanted, that there is a king and lord, a governor of all and everything? So the fact that he puts this into a rhetorical question indicates that this part of his argument is the one which is not contested. The Christian faith, that's the contested thing, but this argument, this observation or evidence, this is evident to all, to everybody. And that's something we can often observe in the old thinkers, that they present this argument as an observation. It's clear to everybody. Often they don't even deliver arguments for it. They just state, that's the fact, everybody knows it. So the early thinkers build on this observation and use it. And this idea that faith, some form of faith, the idea of God is innate in humans, is handed down to theology of the Middle Ages and even of the Reformation era. And that's important because nowadays many people dispute this. Many would say Luther would never say that, but we have, and I will show you that, we have evidence for that. So I will focus here on Luther, jump over the Middle Ages. I want to present you a note, a passage from Luther, from his lectures on Romans. That's a very early quote. And he writes, or speaks about the natural knowledge of God. And his argument is the idolaters' veneration is false, but even if it's false, even if they venerate false gods, they still testify to the natural knowledge of God, because, that's his argument, all who put up idols, worship them, and call them gods or God, they show with certainty that they have the knowledge of the divine in their heart. And this idea was taken up by the so-called Lutheran Orthodoxy. That's the great Lutheran theology which followed the Lutheran Reformation. It tried to preserve insights of Luther's theology, but also developed on the basis of the medieval scholasticism. And they have huge textbooks in which we can, mostly at the beginning, in the first chapters, already read that the knowledge of God is, and we have this quote from Johann Gerhard, from the womb engraved and impressed on every human soul, namely from those principles which are born with us. Or Johann Quenstedt, another great theologian of that time, writes, this knowledge is present without consideration and operation of the mind. Nobody, not even children, lacks it. So Lutheran Orthodoxy, they were great in systemizing theology, and they developed a twofold doctrine. They called the idea I was talking about the notitia Dei naturalis insita, the implanted natural knowledge, or you can also say the innate knowledge of God. And they differentiated it from the notitia acquisita, the knowledge that of God that is acquired a posteriori through experience and observation, through reflection of the world. So that is the way of philosophy. So if we speak of natural theology, the reflected discipline, that would be the notitia acquisita. But they insist there is the notitia naturalis insita, the innate knowledge is present before that, before any reflection. But if we go through the centuries, through the Enlightenment era and the 19th, 20th century, this doctrine saw a sharp decline and finally a rejection of the natural knowledge of God. So this rejection was the prerequisite in German Neo-Protestantism. That's a movement of the 19th century. And from there became the dominant position in the so-called dialectical theology of the early 20th century. So Karl Barth, the main leading figure of the dialectical theology, he writes, man has completely lost the capacity for God. Hence, we fail to see how there comes into view any occasion for the common exhibition of at least the possibility of inquiring about God. So that means humans, without the revelation, without the Bible, without Christ, cannot even ask about God. We don't have any idea about God. And this is the main view, at least in Protestant theology, but you can also see this in other traditions. They stress that outside revelation, or at least practiced religion, there is no, they speak of thematic knowledge of God. So you can see that in the Protestant theologians Pannenberg or Robert Jensen, but also in the Roman Catholic theologian Karl Rahner. So it's become a staple nowadays. A natural knowledge does not exist. However, curiously today, it's science that claims that religion is completely natural. And this brings me to my second part, to the cognitive science of religion. So one of the early figures of CSR, Stephen Macaulay, has coined the expression that religion is maturationally natural. That means religion develops like other human traits, such as language acquisition or walking, during the process of normal maturation. So in early childhood, without the need of particular education or cultural tools, all human children would develop such maturationally natural traits. For example, we would develop language in the normal course of development. We would develop walking, so it comes more or less automatically. And he says this applies to religion too. Like we develop our language, we develop some kind of religion. We have to say for the cognitive science of religion, that does not mean that religion is innate. Innate is a difficult concept for modern science. Generally in biology, innate is regarded as a pre-scientific concept. You would say if you have regularly occurring traits, they are usually caused by a combination of causes like genetic, stable environmental stimuli, and learning. So even if you have, for example, song patterns of birds, they are a combination of genetics and learning. So they would not speak of innate, but they would call religion natural. So when they call religion natural, they would say religion emerges from ordinary cognitive processes which develop during maturation, during childhood. And at the core of this religion, which emerges naturally on the basis of cognitive processes, at the core of these beliefs are so-called supernatural agents. That's a very important concept for the cognitive science of religion. And the description of those agents is significant for the question of a natural knowledge of God in theology. That's where theology and the cognitive science of religion meet. I will show you how CSR describes such supernatural agents. We have one very important figure, Justin Barrett. He is one of the main protagonists of CSR, and he describes the traits of supernatural agents. He writes, God concepts must be counterintuitive, an intentional agent possessing strategic information, must be able to act in the human world in detectable ways, and must be capable of motivating behaviors that reinforce belief. So what I want to do now is explain to you what all those concepts mean. So what does he mean when he talks about counterintuitive? So it's in the cognitive science of religion, they often speak about the fact that there is a prevalent error that religious ideas appear unnatural only to the beholder from the outside, but they are entirely normal to the members of that religion. That seems not to be true. What makes supernatural concepts supernatural is that they are exceptional, even to those who are familiar with them, because they contradict intuitive expectations. Cognitive science has shown that people have intuition about basic biological, psychological, and physical regularities in the world. They are called folk ontologies. So to give you examples, we would intuitively know that plants would not suddenly move away, that other humans would answer questions, a stone would not, or that animals in a barn would usually not be able to escape through the walls. That's not something we have to learn or to reflect upon to be aware of it. It's there, more or less naturally. So these are intuitive expectations we have, but supernatural agents violate those expectations. So we have in some religions, for example, a mountain that wants to eat and demands food. So you have the mountain as a specific category in the intuitive expectations, and this category usually excludes eating, for example. Or we have animals that speak. Usually our biological animal category excludes language. So there are small violations of our intuitive expectations. And those violations seem to increase the memorability and transmission of religious ideas. So they make sure we remember them, and they make those concepts curious enough to be shared with others. So therefore, a certain degree of counterintuitiveness, or you could say a certain degree of being unnatural, seems to be required to successfully maintain and spread ideas of supernatural agents. So that's one essential features in religion, counterintuitiveness. So the next aspect is intentional agency. According to CSR, many of those supernatural agents are represented as human agency. Not only a mountain or an animal, most supernatural agents are somehow represented as being like humans, you can say, because CSR claims humans are most trained to deal with this kind of agency. Intuitions about another person's feeling and intention are not only important for social interactions in groups, but they seem to be necessary for survival. Is the other person I'm meeting ready to cooperate, or will they harm me? So I have to make very quick decisions about another person. So we are very well trained to deal with human agency. And this human agency is intuitively connected with the person category. So a human is a person, and this person category comes with a lot of more intuitions. So with a person, we connect intuitions that they have the ability to listen, to understand, to have feelings, intentions, expectations. And the person category is regarded to be the reason of the strong anthropomorphism of most deities. So if we represent the supernatural agents as agents, we would give them the shape of a person because we are well equipped to deal with that. So, but then we have on the other side theology that traditionally criticizes this anthropomorphism. The divine is seen as radically different and essentially not human. The problem from a cognitive view is that the underlying intuitive person category is a very strong basis, which is very quickly available. So we don't have to think about it. It's just there in a matter of not even seconds. It's quicker than that. The theological theories are often sophisticated and require conscious mental effort, and that takes time. So CSR has shown that the intuitive anthropomorphism bends the representations of God in believers and even in professional theologians. So we have ideas of divine omniscience or divine omnipresence. They are very complicated concepts, and we have to think about them. It requires a lot of cognitive effort to hold them, and the person category is way quicker, and it's unconscious. It's unconsciously present. So these two interact with each other, and the intuitive person category interferes with those concepts. So that's the issue with intentional agents, with human agency and supernatural concepts. We have the third point, strategic information. So when we say God is omniscient, CSR would say supernatural agents do not know everything. The latter would be cognitively too complex, and in contrast, it would have no relevance in everyday life. So a popular example is God needs not to know the contents of every refrigerator in the world. It's not relevant to us. What is relevant is knowledge about social interaction, about cooperation, exchange, and reproduction. So knowledge of a person's intention and hidden behavior is strategic information because it reveals a person's trustworthiness. And if I have a supernatural agent on my side, which has insight into this strategic information, they can be either a useful ally or a dangerous enemy. If they know my intentions and my intentions are bad, they are able to interfere with it. So, strategic information, that's the third feature. The fourth is detectable action. Humans, that's the claim by CSR, have evolved to detect agency. The CSR says for survival, it was far more advantageous to suspect agency as the reason behind occurrences in the environment. For example, a sudden noise, it's more advantageous to assume that there is agency behind us than just the wind. It could be, in early human times, a matter of life or death to detect agency. So is a noise caused by a danger, predator, or is it the sign that there is a prey? Is there something? Yeah, we have food. So it is better to err and just to assume agency, even if there's not agency, because in case there is agency, it's very advantageous to detect it very quickly and act accordingly. So CSR assumes that humans developed an intuitive hypersensitivity for agency that leads to assuming agency even when there's no visible agent. And this may enforce the human tendency to suspect intentional agents, particularly behind fortune and misfortune. So what are the reasons for what happens to me? Especially when people have bad experiences, go through difficult events in their life, they often ask about what's the reason for that, what's behind that, who is behind that. And this is the power of supernatural agents. So they might be invisible, those agents, but the events they bring about, fortune, misfortune, or reward, punishment for good or bad behavior, are very visible actions or events. So we have here, even if the agents are invisible, we have detectable action because they are connected. So that brings me to the last feature, behaviors that reinforce belief. Supernatural agents with strategic information and the power to punish or reward can be a threat or a chance. And in any case, it is very commendable to be on good terms with them. Due to their connection with the person category, people have intuitions how to achieve this. They give something to those agents and hope for a favorable reply. So CSR calls them exchange partners. Supernatural agents are treated as exchange partners. So religious practices such as rites, sacrifices, but also loyalty, dedication, belief can be givings to a deity to secure reward. So I give something, so I get back something. So these are the features of God or supernatural agents according to the cognitive science of religion. What does all this mean for theology? So I mentioned at the beginning that in theology today, the traditional doctrine of a natural occurring belief in God is usually rejected. CSR, if they are right, show that there is indeed a naturally occurring belief in God. That's the one aspect, but the other is it also explains its content. It's not only saying, yes, there is something like this. They also tell us about how this belief about God is, what is its content is. So we have this on the one hand, but on the other, I would like to caution and say we cannot just simply integrate these scientific theories and say, great, there's confirmation, and now we can go on with it. We can just integrate it in theology and build on it. That's not possible. Because we have to see already in the tradition, we had a dialectical relation to this innate knowledge of God. Not all theologians, we have to acknowledge, had high confidence in this innate knowledge of God. We have, for instance, Thomas Aquinas. He discusses John of Damascus' view that there is an implanted knowledge of God. And Thomas Aquinas says, yes, there is some knowledge of God's existence which is implanted in us by nature, but he cautions this is only in a general sense, with some confusion. So he writes, knowing that God is, and here he quotes the Damascene, is naturally inserted in us in a general sense, with some confusion, insofar as God is humanity's beatitude. But this is not actually knowing that God exists, because many deem man's highest good, which is beatitude, to be riches, pleasure, or something else. So in humanity, there's a natural striving for happiness, but what already Augustine talked about, usually humans fail to seek happiness in God, naturally. So they don't seek a God as their highest good. They direct this search for happiness to earthly goods and earthly pleasures. And therefore Aquinas says, this is not actually knowing that God exists. We take something else for God. So for him, that's not proof. And as I said, he's very reluctant to concede this naturally implanted knowledge. Luther derives the innate knowledge of God from natural morality. That's an important connection. The innate knowledge leads, in Luther's view, to the realm of ethics, or in Lutheran theology, to the God of the law. So Luther stresses all human beings have the general knowledge, which is that God exists, that he has created heaven and earth, that he is just, that he punishes the wicked, etc. But what God thinks about us, what he wants to give and do, that he liberates from sin and death and rescues us, which is the proper and true knowledge of God. This the humans do not know by nature. We have to read. And he goes on in another passage, but it is not the proper knowledge of God that happens through the law, be it Moses or the one implanted in our nature. So here again, we have the affirmation. There is some implanted knowledge about God in us, but this is not the proper knowledge. The other knowledge happens through the gospel, which is called the knowledge of grace and truth, the evangelical knowledge of God. So we see here this dialectical attitude towards this traditional doctrine or this natural observation. And if we connect this innate knowledge of God with the cognitive science of religion today, with its natural intuitive religion, we have to say that this modern research, like this innate knowledge and tradition, receives a very specific place in theology. It is differentiated from faith, the faith of the gospel. It's equated with the law. That means it is connected to the old covenant, in which the relation between God and humanity was established by the obedience to the Torah, to the law of the Hebrew Bible, and not by grace and salvation through Christ. Law and gospel are connected, also in Reformation theology, through a very complex and dialectical relation. So the idea in Reformation theology was law is fulfilled and therefore abolished by Christ, and yet it can still reveal human sin. So we have this dialectic. It's fulfilled, but it's still relevant. So if humans fulfill the rules of the law, they cannot earn salvation. That's the important idea. They cannot earn God's love or can force God to give his love. And yet the law leads them to Christ. That's a very important point in Luther. The law is still valid in that it leads us to Christ, because it shows us our need for forgiveness and grace. So Christian theology has to affirm that any natural knowledge of God, innate or acquired by philosophy or theoretical consideration, contains indeed some truth, but it is surpassed by God's ultimate revelation in Christ. And this must also be applied to the cognitive science of religion if we want to integrate it into theology. There are convergencies, but there are also divergencies with the Christian faith. And this I would like to present you. So first, if we look at the convergencies, we can say, as I already mentioned, CSR confirms that there is a naturally occurring knowledge of God or supernatural beings. There is a universal comprehensibility of the idea of God. People understand the word God more or less naturally. So you can talk to people who are not religious at all, and they still know what you mean when you say God. And this is not only transmitted by culture, but apparently and naturally. So because our intuitive representations of and expectations about God present us with some natural knowledge about higher beings, transcendent beings, and they are independent of culture, of concrete religion, of an individual. So we have some parallels between the supernatural agents in CSR and the theological doctrine of the innate knowledge. I would like to present you this. So we have in CSR, the cognitive science of religion, they speak of supernatural, counterintuitive, intentional agents. And the traditional doctrine of the natural knowledge in theology, of course, speaks of a transcendent personal being. Even Luther admits this is something people know by birth. Then CSR talks of detectable power, strategic information, exchange partners, and theology speaks of God as a creator, lawmaker, and judge. That's the traditional doctrine. And CSR speaks of rituals, which are motivated by belief and enforce belief, and the natural knowledge of God and theology speaks of the natural awareness of the duty to venerate God. So that's Luther speaks about this. You must venerate God. That's innate in all humanity, he says. So you have this parallels between CSR and the traditional doctrine. And this is important because there are people who say you can't connect CSR to theology. It's completely different from what theology says. But I think there are parallels we have here, and we can connect them both. And what it also says, or what CSR can explain too, is that intuitions we have naturally, innate, or however, provide plausibility and stability of religious ideas. So the closer religious ideas are to intuitive expectations, the more readily they are accepted. People accept God as a lawmaker very readily. Even people who are not religious would accept that. And the more effortless they are held. So if you, CSR, of course, as a science, carries out a lot of empirical research, and if they have experiments, they always can show that statements like this, God as a lawmaker, is very quickly affirmed, whereas other statements, people need to think about it and need more time. So that's a sign which shows that those ideas are based on intuitions. We don't have to reflect about them. CSR talks about the cognitive anchors of religious ideas. So what our religious ideas, the stability our religious ideas have is grounded in the deep subconscious architecture of the mind. So it's connected to intuitions, dispositions. We don't have to reflect about it. It's just there. That makes it very stable. So Jonathan Barrett speaks of cognitive anchors. So that means in the end that religious beliefs are much less dependent on theoretical explanation. They are rather rooted in pre-reflective, intuitive, making sense of the world and our experiences. So I will come back to this because that's an important aspect, how we deal with those insights in theology. So that's the convergencies. What are the divergencies? Again, the cognitive anchors, even though they ground religious ideas and provide stability, they destabilize Christian ideas, on the other hand, too. Particularly when theological doctrines or religious beliefs differ or even contradict those intuitions. Then they interfere, and then there can be problems. So destabilization or less plausibility for theological doctrines. I will give you two examples of doctrines which clash with those intuitions. That's one example is the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, and the second is divine grace. So the Trinity has to deal with the problem that we very readily have available the intuitive person concept. So that is one of the strongest of the intuitive ontological templates or expectations. People tend to apply it also to animals or even to inanimate objects. So there are experiments. If you have moving dots on a screen, people start to explain it in very anthropomorphical terms, what they do, even if people know they are just dots on a computer screen. So this intuitive person concept is very strong, and it's unconsciously applied to a lot of things. And this unconscious application is enforced by the biblical idea of a personal God. Here they meet, but this makes it almost impossible to represent God as three persons. So we have God as one person on the one hand, and then we have the three Trinitarian persons. That causes a lot of problems, because our cognition produces intuitions about the persons of the Trinity as three separate individuals. But three persons, according to the intuitive biology, cannot make up one being. That's impossible. So we have a lot of problems resulting from that. And the early discussions about Trinity, Trinitarian theology, up to the issues in 20th century theology seem to be rooted in this intuitive person category. So we have, for example, Barth, modern theologians who try to avoid speaking of persons, to avoid those issues. So Barth, for example, replaces the word person by way of being, or Karl Rahner speaks of distinct manner of subsisting. Very complicated expressions. And I think if we take the insights of the cognitive science of religion seriously, we would have to say it is not very likely that such theoretical constructs can solve the issues caused by the intuitive person concept. So we have a very theoretical approach to an intuitively caused problem. I would suggest that the power of intuitions should be met on a similar level in an area that is closely related to intuition, and that is the area of experience. So we have already in early theology theologians such as Augustine point to personal experiences, to life's dynamic, the fluidity of self-experience. So this might be more effective to deal with these issues. So we have Augustine who employs analogies, for example, love or the human soul. According to Augustine, understanding the Trinity is not so much a matter of theoretical consideration, he writes. It's rather a spiritual task. For him, his aim is to transform the human soul into an image of the Trinity. He wants to lead the believers into participation in the Trinitarian God. And that, according to Augustine, would create insight understanding of the Trinity, not so much the theoretical explanations. And he would say the more our soul grows into an image of the Trinity itself, the clearer we will understand the triune God. So we have here a very experiential approach to the Trinity. So To strengthen such a Trinitarian faith and ground Christian life in the life of the Trinity, it may be more effective to reserve the intuitive person category for Father, Son, and Spirit. That's the tradition. They speak about the persons, but leave the idea of God more open. And stress rather the hiddenness of the divine nature. It's that it is ineffable, that it is a mystery. This might help to direct the power. I mean, the intuitive person concept is very powerful, and we can use that, but we should direct it to the Trinitarian persons, while allowing for the idea of God to transcend the intuitions linked to a person. That's what Karl Barth, for example, says in his Gifford lectures in the 1920s, that he stresses God transcends what it means to be a person. God transcends person. So we can't put God into the person category. He's always more. So that's one example, how to apply or how to include CSR in the Trinitarian doctrine. The other example is grace, friendship, and trust in God. And that's, for me, I'm a Lutheran theologian, that's very close to my heart. What we can observe is that people engage in all sorts of negotiations with God, regard good behavior as a source of eternal or earthly reward, ask themselves what action triggered a certain misfortune. You often observe that people, if they are in difficult life situations, start going to church and expect something to change, not necessarily to enter in this spiritual process, but there is, I give God something, I expect something back. It's very intuitive. And even among believers, the confidence in divine love, in grace, gratuity, forgiveness seems to be rather fragile. Many Christians, of course, as well as non-Christians, believe that salvation can be earned by good behavior. There's a survey from 2020 by Ligonia Ministries, which says that only 31% of the Protestants, which the faith is built on this insight of justification, only 31% of the Protestants agreed with the suggestion God counts a person as righteous, not because of one's own works, but only because of one's faith in Jesus Christ. So most of them, almost 70%, do not agree with this, and that's one of the core suggestions of the Reformation. So intuitively, we have issues to really believe that. Theologians have always stressed that the revealed knowledge contradicts the natural knowledge of God in this regard. So Luther talks about the God of the law, but already Aquinas speaks about the so-called fides informis, the faith uninformed by the love of God, which is not salvific. But God's revelation in Christ is a rather counterintuitive. This belief that we earn something without doing something. Theology, whether it's Protestant or other theologies, stress that against all expectations of the natural knowledge, God's true will is to forgive, to justify, to redeem humanity. What CSR tells us is that God is a lawmaker, that gods or supernatural agents have to be feared and not to be loved. So they are behind misfortune, they enforce moral or ethical behavior, but the supernatural agents in CSR are not agents who love us or provide or offer forgiveness, grace. That's concepts you would never see in literature of cognitive science of religion. So we would say good deeds do not constitute a reliable claim to fortune. They are not the condition to earn God's grace. We can't force God to give us grace. We would say the basis of morally good behavior is an inner conversion by God's grace. So first comes God's grace, and then we are converted to good behavior. But as I said, this is rather counterintuitive because of this expectation or intuition that I have something to give to God to earn his grace or forgiveness. And cognitive science of religion confirms this tension between the natural and the revealed knowledge. In this point, they say supernatural agents are intuitively treated as exchange partners. They are regarded as source of punishment or reward, so they have to be feared. But the intuitions involved in this assessment of fortune, misfortune, how I lead my life, what consequences my action have, the intuitions involved with that lend strong plausibility to the treatment of God as an exchange partner. And we can see that also in public perception. So very often religious intuitions are perceived primarily regarded as intuitions for morality and ethics. So church says people how to behave. But what is often forgotten is Christian faith wants to transform people. By God's love, by the experience of God's love. So the teaching of God's unconditional grace and love is extremely counterintuitive. The God of the law is more credible than the God of the gospel. And I think Christian preaching and our teaching have to take this into account. I think again here it's important to meet the power of those intuitions on the level of experience. For example, metaphors of parental love may be helpful, as well as, and that's a concept in Aquinas, friendship with God. Not fear, not punishment, friendship with God. With Christ who gave his life for his friends in John 15. But even more important is the experience of God's love and grace in worship, in liturgy, and individual practice, in spiritual exercises or individual prayer. We have to experience this. It's not only a theoretical concept. It's, in the first place, it's an experience. What might be rather counterproductive in the light of CSR research would be the enforcement of God as a lawmaker and judge. And I know from my Protestant traditions that they can be very strong in sermons like this. You know, preach to the congregation, ethics, morality. The problem is when such sermons forget that all action, all good behavior, all ethics, which is indeed important in Christian faith, yes, but it's rooted in God's prevenient grace and love. That's the first thing, and everything else develops from that. So even if a purely moral sermon, a purely ethical presentation will have a high plausibility, people, your parish would agree, they would be happy, you would tell them what they intuitively know already. It meets the intuitive expectations, but I think it will be costly. It risks undermining the genuinely Christian perspective. and corroborates the view that the Christian faith is primarily morality. And I think what we have to stress is that Christian faith is in the first place an inner transformation by God's love and grace. So that's the right order. So we have to be very careful with these very ethical sermons, for example, or an isolated ethical moral teaching. So I think that's something which we have our disagreement with CSR, but it's important to know and to acknowledge where those disagreements lie, and we can still work with it and they can still be relevant for us. So I'd like to come to the conclusion. The whole issue or phenomenon of the cognitive of science, of the science of religion, shows that science is or can provide very important insights to theology, but we cannot simply replace theological ideas with science. It doesn't work like this. Scientific insights have to be accommodated in a theological way. We have to carefully evaluate the place in the theological systematic, the relation to the basics of Christian faith to accommodate those scientific insights. We always have to keep in mind that revelation is not something that can ever be considered by science. Science excludes it from the beginning. But the Christian way means we gain a higher understanding of our world. So it's like Anselm of Canterbury says, credo ut intelligam, I believe so that I may understand. So we can take those scientific insights and consider them from the perspective of Christian faith, of revelation, and then it will start talking to us in a Christian, in a truly religious way. But our Christian basis always have to have the priority. That's where we have to accommodate, and that's where we have to put limits to what science can tell us. So the cognitive science of religion can provide insights, but it's important to see the differences and the limits. So thank you very much for your attention.